to Bridget TV. I am Bridget Birchett, community advocate for stopping the violence against women and girls. And my guest this morning is Dr. Joe Sakran.
Hey, how are you? Nice to see you.
Hi, Joe. Thanks for stopping in this morning. Dr. Sakran is a surgeon, trauma surgeon at Johns Hopkins Hospital, Associate Chief, Division of Acute Care, Surgery, and Director of Emergency General Services. Our topic of discussion this morning will be gun violence in America, trauma, and as it relates to domestic violence. Dr. Sakran just finished giving a fantastic talk on gun violence here at University of Pennsylvania Presby Trauma Center. Joe, gun violence and domestic violence in America, what is 5% of women will be killed, or by abused women will be killed by their intimate partners, and if the gun is in the home, it goes up to 12%. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, Bridget, thanks for having me on your show. It's a pleasure to be here, and really exciting to have a chance to talk to you again. So, in regards to looking at gun violence and how it relates and interplays with domestic violence, I think probably what you're referring to is that abused women have a 5-fold increase in death if their abusers have a firearm in the household. And the other figure you're referring to in regards to when does that number go up, it's women that are assaulted by a firearm versus being assaulted by, say, a different weapon. Their risk of death is 12-fold increase when a firearm is used. So those are some staggering numbers that we're seeing within the community, and it's really something important to focus on because, you know, we don't always hone in on the domestic piece, which is such an important piece for us as Americans, in order to really kind of peel back those layers and figure out, you know, where is the problem and how do we address it.
And it's an epidemic. It's a public health issue, correct?
Well, I think when you look at firearms in general, absolutely, we are dealing with a public health crisis. We all know the numbers. Every year, over 30,000 people die from firearms. Now, that's 2/3 are suicide, and the rest are primarily homicide, and there's some other unintentional ones that are broken out into that entire group. But that's significant. We're talking about every year. So when you break that down daily, we're talking about over 90 people a day, and over, that's deaths, and over 200 injured per day across America. So when you think of, you know, the injuries, you also have to think of the disability that people live with and the economic burden that brings to our country.
You've got an interesting story how you became a trauma surgeon. Would you talk about that?
Sure. Well, you know, all of us have different reasons as to why we do what we do. And mine is a little bit different. But when I was 17, I was nearly killed after being shot in the throat. And I don't know how you were at 17, Bridget, but I can tell you that most 17-year-olds have no idea what they're going to do in life. They don't really appreciate the fact that they're mortal. They might not appreciate their families. And so it was an eye-opening experience that allowed me to appreciate the second chance that I was given. And then it inspired me to go into medicine. It inspired me to become a trauma surgeon. And then it really got me thinking as to how do I work at that nexus of medicine, public health, and public policy to be able to make a difference on a population level.
Okay. And to talk about domestic violence and how it also relates to mass shootings. Why don't you touch on that?
Yeah, so there was an interesting study that was done by Everytown where it looked at mass shootings, which they were defining as 4 or more fatalities. And what they found is between 2009 and 2014, 57% of mass shootings were associated with the person killing someone from their immediate family or an intimate partner, either current or former. So that's a staggering number. So the majority of mass shootings are associated with some sort of domestic violence piece, and I think that's something that we don't always really focus
that
on.
we don't talk about.
Yeah.
And you worked at MUSC in Charleston.
I did.
Yeah, in South Carolina, and I just moved back from South Carolina. I was down there for 20 years, and now I'm living here in Philadelphia. You were down there, as I was, doing Emanuel 9, the shooting down in Charleston in Emanuel 9. The young man that committed that horrible crime, horrific crime, actually was from my county, Lexington County. Lived in Lexington County, South Carolina. We need common sense gun reform, and reason why he was able to get access to the gun was because of the background check. Talk about that. What can we do? The NRA propaganda is this: they tell women that in order to be safe in America, you need to have a gun to fight back with your abuser. So now you have the wild, wild west in your living room, in front of your children. You know, your abuser has a gun, you have a gun. What happens then?
Right. Well, I mean, I think, look, this is an important issue. First of all, let me just say, as you know, the Charleston mass shooting was just devastating for all of us in the community. And I think, when we look at what happened at Mother Emanuel, I was very proud to see the community come together afterwards to try to figure out how do we approach and address this problem that we have. And I think that we need to do that more across America. But what also has to happen is, I think our elected officials have a duty to represent Americans. And when you look at Americans across the board, we have a lot more commonality than dissimilarity. And that's what I think a lot of people don't understand is, people want to make gun reform, gun violence such a divisive issue. Mm-hmm. When in reality, that polarization is coming from a lot of these strong lobbying groups. And what I can tell you is that when you look at things like universal background checks, over 90% of the American public agrees with this. And even when you look at specifically the NRA members, over 74% of NRA members agree with this. So why is there a disparity between the leadership and the membership? And I think that's something that we have to really address. Over the next presidential term, if we continue, the status quo, 120,000 people are going to be killed from guns. Now, part of this is we don't have enough good data. So I think from a federal standpoint, we also need to invest in funding the CDC, the NIH, and allowing firearm research to happen so we can approach this in an evidence-based manner. And that's something since the 90s we've struggled doing because of the significant gun lobbying pressures that are really put on our elected officials.
Absolutely, and the money, follow the money.
Right.
That is has a stronghold on our elected officials, and I mean, I'm just going to put it out there with the research and the state houses, because a lot of the lobbying is happening that affects the community happens at the state level, and that's where the laws, the most of the laws are passed at the state level the lobbying is happening at the state level.
That's a great point. Most government happens locally, right?
Exactly.
And I mean, if you look at, we're talking about domestic violence here, we're talking about women. If you look at kind of our legislation across the board, so in 35 states, okay, individuals, okay, people that are convicted of domestic misdemeanor crimes, okay, are still able to purchase and use guns, despite the fact that they're prohibited under federal law, right? But there's not enough resources on the local level to reinforce this. So there's a lot of disparity that happens, I think, as you're pointing out, between the local level, the federal level, and we, have a lot of great people out there that have been, advocating. Marlon Kimpson from Charleston, as you know,
Right.
has put together some really thoughtful, sound legislation when it comes to common sense gun reform. President Obama has been, struggling and working on this, this past presidential term. So I think there's a lot of interest, and the interest is because we want to make our community safe. This is, not about taking away firearms. There's over 300 million firearms in our country, and I think, when people start using that type of rhetoric, it's not very helpful, and it just polarizes the topic.
I want to talk about the trauma that's associated with gun violence and domestic violence. What are the long-term effects for women and children who are involved in this? Because it's a chronic form of trauma. It's not a one incident. It's over a period of time and reoccurring.
Yeah, well, that's very true. A lot of these abusers, right? They abuse, they stop, they abuse again.
Right.
And so I think what you're pointing out is very important, is that there's this, chronic fashion to it. And it's devastating. I was grateful enough and thankful enough to grow up in a household that didn't have that.
Right.
But I have, friends that I know that have experienced this firsthand. And this not only affects them emotionally, but also affects them physically, from a professional level, from being just productive in society. It really takes a toll. And so figuring out a way to make this a comprehensive approach when we're discussing firearms, whether we're looking at homicides or suicides or within the domestic household, I think is critical, because it really is going to take a layered approach for us to be effective in ending gun violence.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you're dealing with children, I myself grew up witnessing violence, intimate partner violence, and there was never a gun or anything like that involved. But there are children who are witnessing not only the violence, but also the gun violence. Talk to me about, I know we talk about how mental illness is not, doesn't play a major role in mass shootings, and but in domestic violence, if it goes untreated, are we looking at long-term effects of, for children, for the victim of some type of mental illness as far as disparity?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. Let me just back up for a second and just clarify the mental illness piece.
Okay, sure.
So when you look at violence in general, violence is associated with about a 4% association with mental illness.
Okay.
Meaning someone that's mentally ill, committing some sort of crime. It's only about 4% of the time, right?
Right.
Now, that's violence overall. So for firearms, it's even less. Okay, right? Now, what happens is that you have to break out firearm deaths, because even though a minority of the overall related events when it comes to firearm deaths are associated with mental illness like depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, when you break it out and you look at, for example, suicide, right? So we know there's a strong correlation between suicide and mental illness. And 2/3 of firearm deaths are due to suicide. So that's why I think it's important to look at it in different layers, because depending upon what you're talking about, the data can change.
Right. Okay.
Now, going back to how we're looking at this overall domestically and long term, I don't think we have very good data to say like exactly what's going to happen, and that's part of the problem. Is we need to figure out from a long-term perspective, okay, what is the follow-up with these individuals? Are they being productive individuals in society, or is it affecting them so much that they just go on to not being able to function? So there's a lot of unanswered questions.
Absolutely. Now, and we're in West Philadelphia, and in fact, this is the University of Penn area, not far from this nucleus, this safe pocket. We've got another different type of community going on, and some places at night it turns into, gun violence. Talk to me about, you're a trauma surgeon. You actually, and you talked about this in your speech that you just gave, where you've got to walk out to that waiting room and tell that family that they've lost that loved one. Looking at the numbers of African American males that are being killed, 17 years old, some younger, not much older, 21, it's an epidemic. I was just at a conference this past weekend where the community is coming together to try to figure out what can we do to adjust, to fix this. Where do we go from here? What are your suggestions, doctor? I mean, you see this. They come into the emergency room, and some live, some don't.
Yeah.
They go back out into the street. And not to get off the topic of domestic violence, but I cannot have this conversation and address this black male issue and violence in the communities.
Yeah, so I think it's important that you're bringing this up, because this is an epidemic. And guess what? African Americans and African American males are disproportionately affected when we're talking about, homicides, and we're talking about our young people. Now, like we've been talking about, the data is different based on how you look at it. So if you're talking about suicides, that actually affects older white males. But when you're talking about the homicides, you're exactly right. This is affecting our young African Americans primarily, or disproportionately. And what I'll tell you is that every time I walk out into that waiting room and have to talk to a family and tell them that their loved one has passed, it's absolutely devastating. I mean, sometimes, as I was saying earlier, the memory of their face is chiseled into my mind, because, I see the grief that they have, and knowing that it happened for senseless reasons is just hard to swallow. And it's so hard to swallow day after day after day. Philadelphia has a problem, but so does Baltimore, where I'm currently at.
That's right.
The intensity of gun violence has increased. And we're seeing that 1 in 3 people in Baltimore who are shot die. So we have a real problem. And I think what you pointed out is critical in regards to figuring out a solution to the problem, and that's engaging the community. So many times we want to tell the community, here's what you're going to do, or here's what I think you should do, versus making them part of the solution. And that's something that I think we've been working on in cities across America, especially recently, and we need to do a better job at.
What I'm wondering, and in my research, have they been able to link the perpetrators who are killing to investigate in their home life any type of domestic violence, children growing up in that home witnessing domestic violence? Because children who do grow up in a home have a tendency that the odds are higher that they will grow up to be abusers, to drop out of school, to be violent, have violent behavior. I mean, has there been any research linking any of this gun violence? Because these kids are young that are doing this.
Yes.
And you can't tell me that they're just waking up one day and saying, I'm just going to go out on the streets and just start shooting. We've got all the social issues that are impacting their behavior, lack of jobs. They drop out of school, so, education level. But is there a link to something happening in the home, going back to childhood, where this is what they were introduced to at an early age of intimate partner violence?
Yeah, so, I mean, as you pointed out, some of those trends that you've read about and researched about, I think exist. the question is specifically when you focus on firearms, has that been elucidated? And I'm not aware of any data that I've read, at least, that shows that actual link. Is probably very difficult to show. But I definitely think that you do see some of the trends that you're referring to. And again, there's not one solution.
Right.
We really have to be thoughtful and have a layered approach about this. And it, begins all the way from kind of that, the family, the home structure, all the way to, what we're doing to try to make our streets safer. And I think unless we approach this in a way that engages all the stakeholders, with perhaps the community being at the center of that discussion, then I think we're missing the big picture.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think at this point we can probably, that'll be our final thoughts on that.
Yeah.
And is there anything else you want to add?
Well, Bridget, I'll just say that I think it's important that you're focusing on this topic. I think that this is a topic that's important to Americans all across this country. And what we have to do is we have to be able to have the strength to have the dialogue surrounding gun violence without the passion. I think we should leave the passion at the door, right? This is very emotional for many of us. I mean, especially as a former victim, but I try to leave that at the door so we can figure out how do we objectively address this issue so that way we can make our communities safer.
Absolutely, and we need to have the dialogue with intimate partner violence also
100%.
associated with it, and so the women and our girls can grow up in safe communities and schools, and also at work.
Absolutely.
That's a whole nother issue when we talk about gun violence in the workplace. That's a real situation happening too.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you. Thank you
so much, Bridget. It was such a pleasure. Thank you very much.
So glad to
Thanks
be
for
able
having
to do
me.
this.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Such a pleasure.
I think that's it for today, and thank you all, and don't forget to visit my blog, 46 Blue Report, and also BridgetBirchett.com.